Welcome to another episode of Coagling Sand. Today is the 25th of May, 2021. I'm trying now to record weekly on Tuesday because no extra time on Mondays lately. But Tuesday I can at least figure out where Monday left me to get into the week, and then I can end with the other newsletter. Did I mention that? I'm using Substack for the show notes newsletter that will get sent out when this particular episode and each weekly episode gets posted to Anchor. And then at the weekend, rather than doing yet another episode of the show, I can send out a little update newsletter, and if anybody wants to subscribe to that, it's totally separate. So you can, and in so doing, I'm trying out the two newsletter services, which I will eventually comment on. I'm going to touch on one thing in this episode. Do we really need MeOps? Yes, we do. Let me tell you why. After I take a drink. A little water for the our weather in Las Vegas is getting slightly drier, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, as I'm making this show, actually right before, I was configuring my Google Takeout for Google Photos. I have two accounts. I have multiple accounts actually, but I have two accounts that were connected in some way to an Android phone or tablet or whatever over the years. So I have photos in the Google Photos feature, application, service, whatever it is. I have photos in both accounts in the Photos view of my data from like 2012. I think I had my whenever they enabled uploading of photos, I guess that's when it started. I've had an Android phone since the first Android device, so somewhere back there. Those were cool phones, even though they were big clunky things. But that's for another day. I do miss a keyboard phone. So I'm doing the Google Takeout on my other account because I've since had Google Fi. I basically went all in on Google Fi with one Google account. And so the other one is sort of like, I have Google One, I back up all my photos in original quality, whatever that really means. So the other account, if you don't know this, they're Google, I know this sounds crazy, but they're changing the way one of their services works. At least they're not getting rid of it completely. So Google Photos on the other account that I have not paid anything for, I'm just going to take them out and not deal with it. So I downloaded it was about 7.5 gigs of data. So to Google's credit, they do make it reasonably painless to download your Google Takeout, aptly named. But it occurs to me, and so when you read the show notes, you can read about my views on Flickr, which I've been a premium user of since I think it was 2009, whatever it was. It's in the notes. So I've been a Flickr user premium for many of those years, for many years. And one of the things I thought was cool about Flickr early on was they implemented this interesting and useful API. And you could actually interact with your images in useful ways. So they kind of handed people, users, customers, not only a useful service, and I've made use of Flickr, though not enough for what I've paid for. Certainly over the last couple of years, it was tending to be another backup dumping ground, if you will, like automated uploading of all the photos on my phone, which was problematic. I don't need every screenshot and every downloaded image or any, there were just tons of things that were not my photos. So the Flickr branded mobile application on Android is problematic, but in general, I had relegated Flickr to other backup. So Amazon Photos with Prime, upload all day, Google One, so I get more Google Drive space and Photos premium features and all that, and Flickr. But Flickr is still a capable platform, and I do appreciate that in the context that I'm going to get to, which is enabling customers, users, people to do things rather than letting them. And you can read my thoughts on this in the notes, so I won't harp on it here. But I'm noticing more and more that the notion of letting your customer or your user do something, it's touted in reviews or in press releases and whatnot that now Android lets you, fill in the blank. It could be lets you adjust the brightness, lets you have a night mode, or changing the contrast, or flipping colors, dark mode, I should say, dark mode at night. And this goes for everything, right? So your podcast client that maybe you're listening to this with right now, your podcast client lets you download a podcast. Well, what does that mean? Lets me. I could download a podcast without your application. So what is it really doing? Is it enabling me to consume what I would like to consume, a podcast or a video or read an article? Is it enabling me to do that when I'm offline? Maybe I'm out for a walk and I don't have good cell phone coverage away from my home Wi-Fi. So I'm just noticing more and more the difference between let and enable. And that kind of brings me around to the notion that I think it would be interesting and ultimately useful, although not without risk of, give somebody enough rope and they'll hang something. But I think if those of us who are involved with development of products and services, especially in the technology arena, but pretty much anything nowadays, if you put yourself in the place of your customer or user, I don't know why I'm differentiating those, but I am. So put yourself in their place and, do I want to be let? Do I want to, hey, this coffee machine lets you brew 2 different kinds of coffee? Or it enables you to brew as many different kinds of coffee as you can imagine. I had an interaction with Spinn, Spinn, one of the co-founders. And they are convinced that their coffee machine, which makes a centrifugal, it is literally a centrifuge. Yeah, I know, centripetal force, the fictitious centrifugal force, but it's a centrifugal espresso machine. And they had the mechanism on display at a food tech sort of mini show as part, kind of attached geographically and temporally, but not administratively, to CES about 2 years ago. So I met these guys. They're based in Holland, and the mechanism, fit in your hand. It was a small motor with a chamber to spin the coffee and water, and there was a little grinder, and so all this self-contained unit. And one of the things we discussed was that they have tens of variables that they measure. I'm going to guess not only the mass, that I'm hoping they measure the input mass of the coffee bean, output mass of the grind, I don't know if they can determine the grind size. That would be tricky. Certainly you have the setting of the burrs, but what do you actually end up with? There are ways to do that, but probably not at that price point reliably. Water temperature, water volume, and many more things. I think they measure TDS, total dissolved solids. They can probably measure output temperature. So anyway, there are tens of variables. And the user interface shows, I'm not picking on Spin, by the way, but this is just a really good example in my opinion. I've never actually, I had a sampling, I think I had 2 espresso shots out of the machine they had set up at the table, and then they had one inside view that you could, there's the mechanism. So the coffee was fine. It tasted great. So I believe it's an application on a phone, which is getting to be a little weird on its own. You must own a mobile phone to use your kitchen in the near future, I think, or anything. But anyway, so the application, the workflow for the user was you take a picture of the coffee bean bag or container, which I guess that means don't throw it away. There are programmed profiles for the bean. Put in your beans and you get espresso, and you can adjust, I believe you can adjust temperature, amount of water. So basically out, do I want a solo doppio? And I haven't looked at the app in a long time. So I think it was temperature, output temperature, I hope, water volume out, and probably strength, some variation of, I guess that would be in conjunction with the water volume. So you set these 3, I think it was 3 settings, and it does its work, and you get your coffee out. And I said, would it be interesting to enable people to have access to many more of the variables, certainly the measured values, and then the settings, to adjust the coffee to their own taste and possibly even learn, practical learning, experimental experience about what happens to coffee when you grind it too fine, or you grind it too coarse, or you use water that's too hot, etc. Or hey, maybe I need to it would be cool if they actually measured, this would be way out of the price range, but measure the incoming water, maybe you could say salinity, but a way to measure, you can measure the conductivity, right? So the mineral content of the water grossly, it's not going to tell you how much magnesium versus sodium's in there, but I just thought it would be interesting to enable the coffee drinker who has purchased this little coffee reactor with so many variables, so many knobs and dials and buttons virtually, internally. Why not enable? They thought that was a crazy idea. They said, well, no, we have it programmed. It makes the coffee that the bean, the provider of the bean, the profile that they have established for what they would call an optimal cup. What is an optimal cup of coffee to the end user? It's the coffee that tastes good to them. And if they're not allowed to change it, this coffee machine lets you brew the coffee prescribed by the source of the beans, or the roaster, whatever that model of specification is. So they let you make a cup of coffee. I feel that they should enable you to experiment with the device that you've purchased. So that was a point of contention. Neither here nor there, except as an example for here and there. So Flickr enables you to download all your photos, by the way. And I did that when the mobile application was uploading every item, everything it could find on my phone and across multiple phones. It was going nuts. And some of the photos were not, I'm like, they're not mine to upload. Now, all my photos upload as private, so it wasn't a huge deal, but why do I need to upload every image known to man that had ever landed? And, it would, if I downloaded an image from my Amazon photos into whatever directory it would end up in, upload it to Flickr. Like, I already had that uploaded, so it would end up looping, and anyway, it's kind of a administrative nightmare. But so I downloaded everything that was uploaded again. I figured, okay, I'll just make sure I keep it, and then I deleted everything that had there was no reason to. I don't need 1,000 screenshots from 5 years of phone and device use. But anyway, the Flickr idea to me is much more interesting than, say, Instagram, which is there is an unofficial API. There's a bizarre API that Facebook provides now that you must be a business. It can't just be my account. And it becomes like, what are they going to let you do? And that can be a little bit frustrating. But I guess in exchange for the free service that is pelt me with advertising and collect all of my data and share it with your advertisers and profit, you get what you get. So there's something I was going to talk about. Bear with me. I found it. I'm going to edit out a little bit of silence that was there. I was checking on something that I wrote down. So anyone who's ever used GitHub knows about the actions now. GitOps, I think they're calling it. Anyone who's ever used a Makefile, anybody who's ever done a whole lot of things when it comes to software development and even hardware development. Anyone who's ever done CNC machining, anyone who's ever automated a spreadsheet, right? There are tools and methods that exist if you are willing to dive in to accomplish things like, hey, I would like to apply a filter to all of my photos. Hey, I would like to update particular files based on some particular parameter. Hey, I would like to add some metadata to the files in this folder that the data themselves are derived from somewhere else. So there are ways to, and these are simple examples, but there are ways to trigger on things and to connect things and to take certain actions. And there was probably one of the first consumer facing tools that hinted at this was called IFTTT, IFT. So if this, then that. And it introduced the user to a fairly rudimentary programmability to take, a social media post. If Instagram photo posted, then share to Tumblr. That was one of mine. If Twitter post tagged with something, then share to Facebook, right? So all these fairly simple one-shot, test, trigger, test, action, done. And that was interesting. Although anybody who ever checked out Yahoo Pipes would be like somewhat disappointed with the limitations of IFTTT, but Yahoo Pipes and a lot of Yahoo everything, always a little hit or miss, which is a shame because Yahoo Pipes was substantially more innovative, but a little bit more complicated to use, which that's the way it goes. So the challenge in my mind is, how do you enable users and customers to use the thing, the product, the service that they have subscribe to, whatever. How do they get to use that product the way that they want to? How are they enabled to get the most out of what I as a developer, or what you as a developer or a maker of something, how do we enable our customers to use the things that they're getting from us to the max, so that at the end of the day they say, yeah, that not only is that a capable product, but because I was enabled to use it in the way that I need to, I was able to integrate it in with my other things. Right? Nobody from Craftsman says, hey, here's a Craftsman hammer, but you can't use it with your Snap-on wrench. Well, maybe we'll let you use it with the socket set, but you can't use it with the open end or box wrenches. Well, what does that mean? So, and by the way, you might use a hammer to break a lug, or take an overly tightened nut off a bolt or something with the wrench. So the way, and these are simple tools, right? So how do you enable your customers to do these things? So the coffee machine example I gave, or today everybody has a phone in their pocket, and Apple is notoriously more locked down, but Android is not much better in many respects. How do you, it lets you automate something. Now we have Google, what the hell's it called? I don't know if it's Actions. I can't remember now. But you can do things like answer a call. They have a very restricted set of prescribed actions, and you can attach voice commands. So make a call or send a message or something like this. But then there's the Tasker application that has a lot of automation capability with a weird programming language. I don't know if I'd call it a language. You can certainly install Python on your phone or other programming languages. You can install Tmux and run a little Linux machine or a Linux installation on your machine. So there are various levels of hackery that you can do, that you can explore on your phone, but you have to be willing to go there. By design, they are not out to enable. They're really, when you think about it, they're really out to keep their users in a sort of a fenced off area under the guise of protecting the user, which to some extent they do. But it can be very frustrating. Sorry, you don't have root access. Sorry, you can't do that. The application has stored data in a private area. For example, if you're using WhatsApp, they are fairly notorious about storing the data on the phone, on the device, to a directory you can't get to. So you have to use their own data transfer scheme if you want to move an account from one device to another. Very restrictive. It's a reminder that that they are letting you use the application to communicate with people. So this is one of the reasons that I've been migrating away from restrictive sandbox, silo applications and services, and swinging back towards, you own your data, you can use the service the way you see fit. I will say that Anchor, which is a nice turnkey, hey, you want to host a podcast? It's free. Upload it. You're up and running. Here's your URL for your feed. Here's each episode. Yeah, okay, nice. And they redistribute to, out of the box, I think it's 3 or up to 6, kind of automatically. I think one of them is Spotify, and one of them is, I'm not looking at it right now, but, getting into the Apple and more, let's say, upscale, pinky out podcast platforms, you have to actually do a little bit more work, but they offer a nice service for free. But what they do not offer is an easy way to automate the publishing of a new podcast episode that that doesn't require manually, clicking on things. Now, I'm sure there's you can always manipulate a web-based interface, but it would be nice if they said, hey, by the way, if you'd like to publish it to your website or upload it to a shared directory on your insert storage service, Box, Dropbox, Google Drive, OneDrive, et cetera, et cetera. Hey, when there's actually, I don't even know if IFTTT does this, or Zapier or any of the other new services now, but hey, when you upload a new MP3 or podcast episode, maybe it's OGG, whatever, it will copy the text into the RSS feed item, publish, etc. So, or schedule a publication. There's a fairly straightforward workflow that can be triggered from a master or main RSS feed. Right, that's my primary feed. Anybody who does most things in computers, there's a primary and a secondary notion, right? So why can I not automate my podcast episode publication? Well, because they do not let me. Similarly with Substack and with Review, they're both nice and they have a lot of features. If you haven't tried those, why not? Free. But Review enables you to connect data sources. I guess they let you get some data from an RSS feed or from a Facebook or Twitter account or whatever. But can I trigger the sending of a newsletter based on like an auto-assembled, like maybe I want to attach a summary, almost like an open graph based feed, right? Like, hey, I'll grab 3 articles from my blog and I'll post summary, sort of similar to a news feed on Facebook. Just do that automatically. And yes, it does remove some of the personality of a hand-administered newsletter, so I can appreciate that. I think Instagram wanted to not have APIs because they wanted genuine, personable, and personal content, good, high-quality postings directly from a person, from a mobile device only. So, okay, maybe there's a rationale, but at the end of the day, maybe I want to publish a newsletter of my own content, but have the methodology of assembling the content, especially if I want to do like 3 or 4 or 5 newsletters, depending on the interest area, some subscribed, some free. It starts to become a full-time job just to administer your own engagement with humans. And maybe that's where the value proposition is. I don't know. But either way, the tools I'm using in association with this podcast are not easily automatable. So that will probably be a topic of discussion later when I say something like, hey, guess what? I'm only publishing at the main URL for an RSS feed. By the way, RSS feeds need to go, but that is another discussion for another time as well. I think they're a throwback to the good old days when internet connections were slow and internet storage was difficult and even priced out of reach for some people. Anyway, so RSS feeds, not a huge fan, but they are what they are right now. And so the main RSS feed for this show should be at a place that I host, and I should be able to construct the item contents and distribute them to wherever they need to be distributed for resharing and reuse with different podcatchers and all that. And that capability should be enabled for the casual user, but instead many of these services will not let the user have that level of control of their own publication, their own content. And that's unfortunate. And that extends, like I said, to coffee machines or to Nest cameras, or to, maybe maybe your local law enforcement agency has more access and control of your front door camera than you do. I don't own one, so I can only imagine. Hey, it's story time. I'm going to tell you a tale about my time at Palm. I owned a Palm Pilot 5000 when they first launched. I can't remember how. I think I got the developer version or something. Developer version of the Palm 5000 sounds about right. So Palm Pilot with the first of graffiti. Although I will say, when I worked in the Newton group at Apple prior to my getting the Palm Pilot, graffiti made its first appearance when I was there on the Newton as a little text entry box that would float over the, whatever, if you're using the note scrolling thing. By the way, the note app, the note application on the Newton, I think was an interesting, cool idea. Maybe that needs to make a comeback. It's another idea for another time. Anyway, so the graffiti box was floating over things, and you would, what is this? An A is like an upside down V. And after, I want to say probably 3 years or so, I actually had a MessagePad 100 that got stolen when I first moved to Silicon Valley in 1993. So I think I was in the Newton group around 96, say. So MessagePad 120 was out. We were working on the MessagePad 2000, which actually did ship, I think. Anyway, so the graffiti application was pretty cool, but very weird. And down the road a bit, Palm Pilot became the Palm and Handspring, I guess, turned into phones. The Palm Pilot 7, I think, had the wireless connection. There was some weird radio that was not really a phone. I don't remember the name. Was it like the Treo or something? Anyway, so there were various Palm-based phones out there. It was very pilot-centric. And somewhere along the lines, I was able to, how was this? Oh, it was because of my Newton connections, actually. A person who I will not name because I don't care for him, but he, back then, that was not the case. But we had a little sit-down interview for lunch with I think he was the director of engineering at the time, and that led to an interview where I met a lot of very smart people. I brought my Android 1, I think it was, the very first Android device with the flip-up screen and the keyboard and all that, the trackball. What a crazy device. And we talked about what worked with that phone and what didn't. Hey, that's foreshadowing for an FFS episode sometime. We talked about what was working, what wasn't, how do you debug something like that, or how do you figure out how to improve, whatever the case was. So we ended up it was an all technical meeting, all very interesting people. And I ended up working there, of course. And the fun part was I was hired in the QA test group, but I very quickly, I was doing my own thing because we had a very short runway to get this phone into Sprint stores and selling, lest Sprint and Palm run out of runway. So there was a little bit of pressure on everybody to get this thing out. And I remember I worked 30 days in a row. My first 30 days were, hit the ground running and don't stop running. And I told someone at some point, because I started automating things, I started writing, the pre was based completely on Linux internally, and they were making essentially a web, a one-page web app interface. So you'd write JavaScript apps, or you could write shell scripts, you could run Python, it was just a little Linux box in your pocket. One of the coolest things I had ever played with as far as like this is a commercial product that is essentially does everything my desktop computer could do, obviously with less memory and less of everything. But it was that is where I think mobile devices should go, not these weird silos. Anyway, so I was there working all the time. For better or worse, I could walk to work in about 20, 25 minutes because there was a giant field or something in the way, but it was slightly faster to drive with traffic and turn signals. Walking because of the terrain was not quite as convenient, but I could walk there. Was that the case? Or no, I'm thinking of Jawbone. But same with Palm. I could walk to Palm pretty easily. It would just take a while. So I was close enough, though, that I did get a phone call at 4 a.m. one time, and I did show up to address a potential issue. But we'll get to there in a second. So at some point, there were 3 flash memory vendors on the approved vendor list: Micron, Samsung, Hynix. So Micron was domestic, out of Idaho. Their flash parts that we're going to use in the design were problematic in that if you removed power, they would corrupt the data on the flash. And because the Palm Pre had a user serviceable battery, which you see less and less often, partially because of this problem, if the user pulled the battery at the wrong time, all of the storage would be corrupted. So corrupting during a write is that's unfortunate, but if you could liken it to like a record needle getting dragged across. Do you know what vinyl records? Yeah, a needle getting dragged across the entire record, scratching everything if you turn the power off to the turntable. So not a good fit. So that got removed from the AVL, which left us with 2 vendors of flash memory. So somewhere between that point and a very, very urgent meeting, there began to be a realization that something weird was happening, and there was some data loss if you were emailing people, or it was, a lot of activity. And that's where it starts, right? You have no idea what's going on, so you have to try to reproduce these things. And I wrote a Python script that would, from the phone, was it from the phone or from? No, you could do it. Well, anyway, you could run it anywhere, and it would just start sending email to any accounts that you could then sync with the phone. You could, using IMAP or whatever. Because that was the first symptom, was receiving a lot of emails. So we just had it emailing like crazy, receiving emails. Eventually, it became clear that it was disk operations. And then here's the challenge. Everything was tight. Everything, including allocation of devices for development. So literally wandering around our building 3 where we were developing the pre, asking to borrow extra, hey, you have an extra phone, And so we ended up with I think I had 22 phones, maybe, device under test, DUT, if you like. And we had to figure out how to test this thing to see what was going on. So Kenneth Albanowski, he wrote a sort of a disk torture tool that could capture its operations so we could replay them. And it would check, so it would do a disk operation and check the results. So, how do we run this in such a way as we can let it run for days and days and days? So I had 22, I'll say it was 22. I had 22 phones, and I had each one of them running Linux, which was nice. And I had become more and more familiar in my low-level hackery about, or I become more and more familiar with how the phone's booted and what happened during the boot process and how you get them to boot off of an external device. By the way, all these are very cool things. I wish phones shipped like this out of the box. You can probably, with developer tools, you can accomplish some of these things. But anyway, so I set out to build the octopus. Visited Fry's Electronics, which of course is no more. I bought all of the hubs that I could get that had been approved or at least qualified as somewhat reliable. USB was problematic in those years. So our USB guru said, yeah, get some of these. I think they were CyberPower 4-port USB hubs. And I got all the hubs they had. And I was able to attach all 22 phones to one host Linux machine. I pulled all of their batteries out and attached I think we called them, I think we just called them fake batteries. So they would register as a battery installed, but it was attached to a power supply, or maybe I didn't even need to do that. Anyway, so each device was attached to this host through these USB hubs. So I had these 22 phones spread out on a table. They would boot up into as minimal a runtime as possible. That's why I'm thinking the battery wasn't in there, because I think it was basically booting into like a service mode. Right? If anybody's ever booted into single user. So I think something like bootp into single user, running and mount the host controller, the Octopus host, for capturing the log data from these disk operations, right? So you're doing disk operations on the internal storage device, and you are logging to a network device, and let them go crazy, right? So then for a little added drama, I added a frame buffer little twizzle that would, when it started running, if it was a Hynix flash part, I think it would color the screen like, red or green. I'm sorry, blue or green. And if it was Samsung, it would be the other. So, maybe Samsung was blue and Hynix was green. And then if there was a failure, if the tool that Kenneth had created dumped out failure, disk fail, the screen would turn red. So we started these things running. We identified the Samsung parts were having problems. By the way, this was something that we weren't able to isolate initially either. So you start to see a coincidence, like, oh, okay, the Hynix parts are working. The Samsung parts are where we're seeing this problem. But until we figured out that it was disk ops, then it was like, well, we're not really sure. Luckily, isolate it down to disk operations. Very simple test configuration. The Octopus was able to run these tests continuously for days and days and days, and capturing many megabytes of data per day per device. Big drive, no problem. And lo and behold, someday, it was say it was 5 days in, red screens. Oh, we got some Samsung failures. Okay. And that's when the real work begins, right? So now it's a question of debugging what happened. So you start working backwards on the log, and you see where, okay, fail, go back, operation. But because Kenneth had created this tool this way, which is pretty standard. I mean, I'm not diminishing what Kenneth did, but it's just the right way to do it. So you could then replay these operations, and it settled down to, these were new flash parts. They were, they had a coalescing scheme internally that would take a particular type of write operation on a particular type of block that was not full, and so on and so on. So they basically identified in a call with Samsung, here's what's happening. And next thing you know, Kenneth and Travis and I think there was one other person on a plane to Korea. So while they were in Korea, they were able to build new flash firmware for your flash parts to try to work around this. And so we eventually, and because we had this, nonstop testing platform, the Octopus, basically I would get a message from them, here, try this, flash the flash parts, and then just let it run. So I could run some with some configurations. We didn't have a lot of phones left, right? So some of those 22 started dying. By the way, the people that quote unquote loaned me their devices for testing were not happy, but that's the way it goes. So, scrape up a couple of Samsung parts and get these things in a mode where we could determine, if the Samsung fix would work, or can we have a software fix, which there was a software fix. So then eventually we came up, okay, here are the two paths to correcting this problem: firmware update from Samsung in the parts, or software fix in the way writes were handled. Because of risk considerations, they went with the software fix. So Samsung had to have a different SKU for Palm that had the previous firmware rev, because they were going to rev the firmware. For their other customer of this part, you may have heard of them. They are a fruit company in Cupertino. And I want to say that we were ordering, let's say we were ordering parts for 500,000 Palm Pres. And Apple was ordering parts. Oh, did I say Apple? Yeah, must have been Apple. Apple was ordering the same exact flash part for 5 million iPhones, something like that, right? Order of magnitude. So we were lucky to have the Samsung parts because, we're down to 2 vendors. And we're about to launch a phone that could make or break Palm and Sprint. They're all in. So for fun, I left the Octopus running, right? We've established what we're going to do with the Samsung parts. We have a fix. They become reliable. So we're just gonna keep hitting the Samsung parts with the newest, path to stability. Just make sure they work. So I said, I'll just let the Hynix parts run in parallel. So we'll be hitting them all nonstop for days and days and days. So I walked into work one day. I go into my little setup in my corner of our lab with my Octopus running. Oh, some red screens. That's not good. And it was definitely not good because Hynix parts were now failing. So I'll never forget it. I walked out the door of the lab, and coincidentally, our director of engineering, with whom I had had lunch only a short number, like maybe 2 or 3 months earlier, happens to be walking. I basically stopped him in his path because he would have hit the door, I think, if he hadn't gotten out of the way. And I say, hey, Chris, I have some device failures. And he looked concerned. And then I said, they're Hynix. And he looked horrified. And he said something like, but the Hynix parts were supposed to work. And I said, yeah, I know. And this led to another emergency set of meetings because suddenly our, order of magnitude smaller part order from what would become our only supplier of flash parts. And, there was no selling a phone without flash, right? So the make or break vendor, Samsung, was now the only vendor because Hynix parts were failing. And we would find out later, while I was still at Hynix, we would find out that their wear leveling algorithm in the flash part would eventually stop. And so as we were hammering these flash parts with reads and writes and whatnot, it would eventually just write the same block over and over. And somebody was able to get a micrograph of one of the failed parts, and it, for lack of a better term, had a burn mark because the flash part, the block where it was doing these continuous writes without wear leveling at all, had destroyed itself. So take from that what you will. The take home for me was that a little bit of like hackery in the dark, right? I had no idea that Hynix parts were going to be a problem. Nobody did. But I had gone to the trouble of setting up this machine. And by the way, Palm at the time had a Solaris machine from Sun that could run one test on one test device. I could, one device on one Sun. So this is an entire Sun workstation. The dot in the .com, those things that could handle all kinds of stuff you threw at them. I'm attaching one Palm Pre and putting, some huge, like 4 megabytes or some large amount of test infrastructure onto this device. So it's not shipping. It's not a legitimate product test. And you got to run these tests for a couple of days and you get one output. To me, that was insane. So the ability to enable some ingenuity, some ideation and innovation can sometimes solve company-killing problems. And so it was a good learning experience for me. And I've often told people that I look fondly at my learning experiences from Palm, even though it was kind of a headache. But it was a very interesting experience to see how coloring outside the lines can definitely save the day now and then. I did on one occasion say out loud, when someone said something about automation or writing some test scripts or whatever it was, I said, I just want to work less. And that somehow came back to me as someone, they heard you complaining that you don't like working here. And I said, no, I've been working here every single day since I started, more than 10 hours a day. I want to work less. I would like to work like a normal person, go home at the end when the sun is still out, maybe work. So it was that sort of a work environment. People were on edge, to say the least. But it was an interesting outcome, and it kind of reinforced my own personal notions about the thinking outside the box, right? Like just because a management architecture, the hierarchy of people distancing themselves from the day-to-day grind, because they have a plan in mind, doesn't mean you should ignore the other things you see along the way. So it was a good learning experience. It led to another interesting Palm story, which we'll talk about another time, when it comes to analyzing a production line, which would come in handy later when I went to Jawbone and did manufacturing analytics, which wasn't why they hired me, but because nobody else was doing it, I just decided to do it. So we'll get to that another time. Anyway, so yeah, the enabling people to do things. And as it happens, I have a different podcast that you may remember I've mentioned, the FFS. I call it FFS Talk podcast because FFS itself is the internet is lousy with those 3 letters, and can't get a Twitter handle for that. So FFS Talk on Anchor and FFSTalk.com on Twitter and so on. I did an episode yesterday. I recorded it yesterday, about an hour of just me rambling, about changing the world. And since I committed the hour of talking to audio and uploaded it and published it, it occurs to me that I left out a whole bunch of stuff, and I had the show notes had some things in it that I didn't actually end up talking about, which were relevant, which I will now follow up after I record this and publish it. I will publish part 2, the unplanned part 2. But it's sort of interesting when you look at changing the world or some lofty goal like that. Palm was going to ship a fairly, not revolutionary, but definitely more than evolutionary device for the time, I mean, it was a really impressive little pocket computer, and much more hacker friendly than the things you can buy now. Enabling users with things like that, it would be amazing to see what people could come up with. And my time with Intel in the Maker Innovator Group, that basically crystallized that notion that when you enable people, they have better ideas than you do. So changing the world, part of changing the world is to determine what that change is doing. If you are changing the world by enabling people to do amazing things, to harken back to Steve Jobs, he said, humans walking are not so efficient, but when you put them on a bicycle, they become the most efficient biolocomotion entity ever. So when you enable people to multiply their efforts like that, to apply their own leverage, it's amazing what they'll come up with. And I think changing the world is going to include more enabling, less controlling, less control for the sake of control, or less control for the sake of profit. So the entire maker notion, enabling people to turn their ideas into reality and all that stuff, I think that is a key component of changing the world, or continuing to change the world. So I'm going to have to I'm going to have to augment with a bonus follow-up episode, the continuation, part 2, delivering Big Delta 2. And I had an entire bit on physicists talking about string theory and M theory, and there's a physicist in Germany, Sabine Hassenfelder, who does, I believe her podcast is Science Without the Gobbledygook, and Eric Weinstein calls her in an interview I posted in my show notes for that, which I never even got to. He calls her a curmudgeon, a physics curmudgeon, because she's kind of the voice of reason, and I think that's invaluable. And so when you enable that sort of interaction with your users, where they can say, hey, this doesn't work, or hey, I did this with your product and it works better like this, right? Everybody wins. So something to think about. In my show notes for this episode, I also have a list of tools and services that I'm migrating away from and the replacements. Just my ongoing effort to make things around me work for me. As I get older, you get older, same time. Crazy. But I'm starting to realize that I really don't want to waste my time on bad customer service, on products that don't work, products or services that I spend my time and or money on that don't do what I need them to do, or that do it poorly. Who has time for disappointment? Not us. So, on that note, I want to thank you. The show notes are at quaglingsand.substack.com. There's a link to that in the Anchor or your other podcast source in the description. However it gets displayed in your podcast client, or if you're listening on the web, there should be a description of the episode, and so there will be a link, but you can visit Quaggling Sand. If you found this podcast, you know how that's spelled. QUOGGLINGSAND. Quaggling Sand. It's, of course, what I called pins and needles. When circulation returns to your hand, your foot, or whatever, when you've been sitting on one of them. I think I was 4, something like that. So quaglingsand.substack.com for the show notes newsletter. There will be a link to this individual episode in the newsletter. So if you are subscribed, you will get a link to the newsletter itself in the show note description. It sounds very confusing. This is why I should just publish the whole damn thing myself. But quaglingsand.substack.com. Subscribe to the newsletter if you like, and There will be some other stuff in there about supporting the show, or I would like to have guests on, because who wants to listen to me ramble on for an hour at a time? I'm going to guess about 3 people. But over time, people can certainly join in the conversation. I would love to talk about what you're working on. Maybe I can express some thoughts on, if you want, on what you're working on based on the various tales I have to tell. Some of them I will share here, some I will share interactively. But I've certainly seen a bit. Yeah, I got to tell, there's a story about when Apple stopped allowing licensing of their products for clones, Power Computing, and I worked at UMax Computing, and the differences and how that unfolded. Very interesting. So that'll be in an upcoming episode. I got loads of them. I got stories from sunrise to sunset, and I'll tell you all of them over time eventually, especially if there's somebody to tell them to as a guest on my show. On that note, I will wish you well. It's been just over 1 hour. I don't know how I managed to talk for so long without putting myself to sleep. So you wake up, get on with your day. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to share with your friends. That's how I get 4 listeners. Take it easy. Until next week. Bye-bye.